So we can't actually do this conference without some great sponsors and organizations. And one of my concerns, and look, I don't want to pick fights with people, but like, for example, tariffs are a terrible idea that we used to learn. Like, if we're going to apply them to an enemy, maybe, but to like replace the income tax with a tariff, we know how much they would generate, and it would actually cause inflation. And there are fights out there on the right that I think it's good to have the conversations, but also we know the ideas, and there are lots of great groups on the right who have kind of stood up and said, we need to like rethink these things. We need to have a voice. We need to actually be engaged on the right in conversations about good public policy and where we can head in order to engage. And so we had a lot of great groups, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm making sure that I'm on track here, because normally I have a paper schedule and I forgot to grab one. And I want to make sure that, yes, we do have a break after Patrick. But we couldn't do this without these groups, and in addition to doing this without these groups, we couldn't have the conversations that we as people on the right need to have without having these groups here. So it's not just great to be able to partner with them to be able to lower your costs, to be able to have a great conference. It's great to have these groups sit on stage, have conversations, discuss the ideas on the right, where we talk about the ash heap of history, where we have, through tried and true methods, put bad ideas away and embrace good ideas. One of my favorite quotes is from G.K. Chesterton about the democracy of the dead, that we do things today because the people who came before us, they tried and failed and tried and failed and then tried and succeeded, and this was the idea they did. And so we should be humble enough to give the dead a say in what we do, because they tried and failed and tried and failed, and the way we ordered a society was through those bad ideas failing and the good ideas rising. And why should we go back and retry the ideas that always failed? Why should we go back to a world where we have weird taxes in this country that actually disadvantage the middle class and the poor? Why should we go back to doing things that Republicans long ago said, this isn't the way to order a society? And also, why should we go back in a way to reorder society in ways that the left wants and embrace ideas from the left? And so I think it's time to have those conversations. And I'm excited to bring up on stage a great sponsor. We couldn't have made this conference work without the Taxpayer Protection Alliance and Patrick Hedger. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Look at this. See, now as I'm standing and talking, everybody rushes and gives me schedules, because like, I don't want to kill my battery, and needed to also make sure that I get you out on time. So Patrick, first, tell us about the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce myself and introduce the organization. My name is Patrick Hedger. I'm the Executive Director of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan taxpayer and consumer watchdog organization that's been around for a little over a decade, and we've been fighting for lower taxes, less government, more accountable government. A little bit about myself. I'm sure, like a lot of you, I looked at the incredible schedule this morning and said, wow, that's a lot of great names, and who the heck is this guy? And I've been in this movement my entire career. And I got into this movement because I'm the son of a small business manufacturer. My family's company was a multi-generation company founded here in the United States, and we made manufactured equipment, soup to nuts manufacturing in the United States. The kind of jobs and the kind of business that any of the politicians that have come up on this stage or will come up on this stage would love to tour and say, wow, look at this. We're glad this is in this country. We're glad that this is happening in my district or my state. And politicians say stuff like that, but then policies destroy businesses like that. My father, when he was president of that company, was never worried about his leading competitors. He was always worried about the 3- and 4-letter agencies out there, IRS, OSHA, EPA, and whatever new creative rule they were going to come next to extract rents out of him. And I got into this line of work because we had to be thankful as a company, as a family, that my grandfather died in 2010 and not 2011. We had to be thankful that cancer saved our American manufacturing business from the IRS. Because in 2010, the Bush tax cuts phased the estate tax, the death tax down to 0. And then all of that came roaring back in 2011. And so I don't think anybody should have to ever be in that position. all the way down to the lowest employee at that company should not have to lose their job because the owner dies. And whether it's the estate tax or whether it is a new oppressive type of regulation, we shouldn't be killing American innovation, manufacturing, and jobs for policies that don't adequately address the cost-benefit analysis, don't adequately weigh trade-offs. Like Thomas Sowell famously said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so our mission is to fight back against policies like that. It's an expansive mission, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. We work on anything under the economic sun. But I think your introduction was right on. There's a lot of things that are coming back these days that we thought were on the ash heap of history, and we're increasingly fighting folks on the right who are bringing back policies that we thought we beat Democrats on long ago.
Yeah, okay, so I'm in my head steering this, and I want to get there but through this, because if I can mention your name without people booing because we're friends even as we disagree, David French, New York Times, interviewed Neil Gorsuch. And Gorsuch and French together made the point, complexity is a subsidy for the big, and it's a penalty for the small. And when you look at our regulations, when you look at our tax code, as everything becomes more complex, like I've got this idea that the American entrepreneur can be a David and slay Goliath and himself become Goliath and himself be killed by the next David. But now our Goliaths are surrounded by the tax code and regulation, the IRS and the three-letter agencies who arrest David for even thinking that he can take on Goliath. And that complexity seems to be like the #1 subsidy for preventing the creative destruction of the marketplace from taking place.
Oh, 100%. We call them regulatory moats. And there's a reason why you increasingly see some of the biggest and largest companies in the United States are building new headquarters all around Washington, D.C., because they understand that the greatest potential benefit to their business and the greatest existential threats to their business exist in Washington. They're not competing on Main Street, they're competing on K Street. And the tax code is so complicated that if you call the IRS, the IRS is the taxpayer advocate has found that IRS agents, frankly, they give like wrong information a lot when you call the IRS and ask, what am I supposed to be doing to comply with my taxes? So even the IRS doesn't understand the tax code. And then the Code of Federal Regulations, love to give a shout out to, I'm an alumnus of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Every year they do a measurement of the Code of Federal Regulations. And we're talking a federal regulatory code that is in excess of, I think it's 200,000 pages now, and the total aggregate regulatory cost on the economy is larger than the GDP of India, the most populous country on the planet. And that's the burden that the federal government puts on American businesses. But to your point, it is those businesses that have the ability to hire the lawyers, hire the lobbyists, and hire the accountants to deal with those things. And it's the small businesses that can never get through that regulatory morass that end up suffering. And so for all the talk that you hear from politicians and regulators about preserving competition and helping the little guy versus the big guy, the minute you pass a 2,000-page bill that supposedly enhances competition, all you've done is empower the people that are able to influence those bills, write those bills, and comply with those bills.
So related to that, I had to hire an accountant as I've gotten into syndicated radio and it started growing. And he looked at things, and wildly, I was paying myself a salary. And he said, actually, if you cut your salary in half and then you do an owner withdrawal disbursement, you're actually going to save your company money and you're going to save yourself money on taxes. And I thought it's stupid that I, as a business owner who pays salaries, have to hire an accountant to tell me not to pay myself a salary because actually it'll save me on taxes. And I was like, what? Why the hell does this system even work? That's like small business owners aren't hiring themselves like strategic tax advisors, and yet they almost have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the federal government, it's amazing. The left hand often doesn't know what the right hand is even doing. I mean, even within agencies, you have regulations and regulatory programs that completely work against one another. Great example is within the Environmental Protection Agency. On one hand, you have a mandate that for more ethanol in your gas tank, which reduces your gas mileage. And on the other hand, the EPA is working with the Department of Transportation to force you to increase your gas mileage. We've got programs that completely work against one another, all within this, again, enormous thicket of regulations. And that is, I'm surprised the U.S. economy grows at all. I mean, that is a testament to the genius of the American entrepreneur that we're even growing at close to 2%. because of just the enormous regulatory cost and the kind of confusing, head-scratching things like your example that business owners are dealing with on a daily basis.
So let's get from the complexity then into ideas that are resurfacing on our side. Why do you think that is? I guess my concern, more accurately phrased, is a lot of the ideas that are surfacing on the right are ideas that in the 50s and 60s were advocated by big labor Democrats, and now suddenly we're having these people on the right bring up the same ideas.
Yeah, I ascribe it to just, I would say, maybe political and policy laziness. One of my favorite quotes is from the children's book, The Phantom Tollbooth. It says, "The only thing you can do easily is be wrong, and that's hardly worth the effort." And I think there's a lot of that going on in politics and policy right now, where it's much easier to tell people what you think they want to hear versus what they need to hear. And it's very easy to take a lot of populist talking points that are generally progressive policies, cover them in more stars and stripes in America, and call that conservative. And there's a lot of that happening right now on the right. I've been in, like I said, I've been in this field my entire career. And I've gone from exclusively fighting progressives to arguing with conservatives as well over really a lot of the same policies. Nowhere is that more evident in the resurgence and interest in antitrust policy, which I think is really upstream of all of the other problems that we can expect from the progressive left. You talk about things like ESG policy, you talk about things like DEI, whatever, corporations doing things that you would never expect corporations to do or be interested in. Why are they doing those things? And it's because they see the threat from the federal government. They see a threat from an empowered progressive government that is going to pick winners and losers, like the governor said. They control that pencil. But the problem is right now we've got a lot of folks on the right that are sharpening that pencil for the left.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, because what I hear from longtime friends of mine is, well, the left is doing this, we're never actually going to stop it, so we might as well do it as well. And my concern to them is that historically, every time we've seen the right embrace what the left is doing, they then build new precedents that, because there's no such thing as permanence in American politics, eventually the left takes back, and now we've set all these massive precedents they then go with gusto to use against us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's effectively, I say this a lot, there's a lot of folks on the right now that think we can use the levers of government to affect our own conservative ends, whether those be social goals or cultural goals or economic goals, by using the bully pulpit, using the sledgehammer of government. And the only way that logically works is if you expect to never lose an election ever again. And I got news for folks. I don't know if you've looked at the recent polling. That's not a guarantee this November anymore. And so the idea that we're going to have a second Trump administration like the first one, where we were able to achieve a lot of the deregulation that was really successful and saw the economic growth that happened in the first part of the Trump administration, that's not a guarantee. And you're absolutely right. We are seeing Republicans, they're calling themselves Republicans, that are now going along with a lot of lawsuits and regulations that are being driven by the progressives, particularly after the technology sector, because nobody likes what the tech companies are doing, and there's different reasons that both sides dislike the tech companies, but the tech companies right now are being used as a proving ground to try and unmoor antitrust policy from one of the greatest conservative victories of all time, which was anchoring antitrust policy to the consumer welfare standard. So prior to Judge Robert Bork and the Chicago School in the later part of the 20th century, antitrust was sort of a whose line is it anyway type policy. You could use it to affect really any end you wanted. And to such an extent that a Supreme Court justice remarked in a dissent on an antitrust case, saying the only consistency I can find in antitrust law is that the government always wins. And that's what the progressives want. They can achieve through, because if you read the underlying antitrust statutes, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, they're pretty vague. They're short and they're vague. They grant a lot of power to government, and it was only after decades of fighting back against those things that we were able to rein all of that back in. And there's nothing more that progressives would love than to be able to unmoor antitrust from that objective consumer welfare standard. And that way, if you are a business, a large enough business, and you are engaged in any sort of merger or acquisition activity, or even not, they can say, well, we'll come after you unless you do what we say. What's your corporate board look like? Is your workforce unionized? What are your carbon emissions looking like? These things are not theoretical, they are happening. What we are hearing right now from M&A attorneys is that they are getting questions from the FTC and the DOJ that they have never gotten before. And they're all related to these progressive policy priorities. And the scary thing is there's a lot of people on the right in Washington these days that are cheering that on.
Yeah, and I want to dive deeper into that, but before we do, I think we should probably explain for people so we don't get too over everyone's head that essentially in antitrust, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if the business is lowering prices, that we look at this from a consumer standpoint, that if a monopoly, for example, is not screwing the consumers by bilking them out of all their money, that it's okay. A monopoly's not bad, an abusive monopoly's bad.
Correct. There are things like economies of scale, right? It's good to have a big airline that goes to lots of different places. It's good to have a big cell phone company that covers you all over the country. It's good to have an internet network that connects you to most of the internet, right? But what we just saw, last week, the federal government won a significant portion of its case against Google. But Google hasn't raised its prices. It's a free service to most people. Advertising prices have come down. They are beginning to chip away at that consumer welfare standard. They got a victory against Google simply for being big. And that's really concerning because it's not going to stop there, right? You can have your problems with the tech companies, plenty of people do, and there's a lot of good reasons for it, but that is going to bleed over the borders of Silicon Valley into the rest of the economy, and the progressives haven't been shy about it. I mean, Senator Amy Klobuchar often says the economy is way too concentrated. It's all the way from cat food to caskets. I don't know why she chose those two examples, but but that just shows you.
She was thinking of her staff.
Right. That shows you the breadth the vision that they have to be able to micromanage the economy. Forget ESG, forget DEI via regulation. They're going to do it via antitrust.
Okay, so in that regard, this is one of those moments where I had the thought and then the thought leaves my head. It's that age, almost 50. No, so you do have, in the antitrust scale, you mentioned Google, but the other one is what struck me, JetBlue and Spirit Airlines, trying to do that merger. They worked on it for about a year and a half, it seems, got all the way to the end, and they said they didn't have gate access in airports. Because of the economies of scale, JetBlue needed to grow. They couldn't get efficiency with the fuel prices, seating, things like that. And suddenly the federal government says, no, we don't think you should do this. The Biden administration doesn't like the merger. The next week, both airlines have to start laying people off and cutting routes.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this. We're seeing a lot of industries abandon mergers and acquisitions, which inject a lot of investment into the economy, by the way. But that in that particular example, yeah, very problematic because Spirit is on its last legs right now. And so the Biden administration's objective was to say, well, we can't really have the top 6 airlines going down to the top 5. They're going to do that anyway because Spirit may not be here with us next year. And then you leave just a weaker JetBlue to be able to compete with the bigger airlines. So there's a problem with where this administration, and again, some on the right are going, where there's an expectation of that quantity of competition is superior, but I think quality of competition is better. I'd rather have an airline that's offering a better service to more places and be able to compete with the other big airlines than having 2 weak airlines that really can't compete whatsoever.
Spirit goes out of business, that'll really make the Spirit Halloween branding real easy for the
right.
corporate headquarters. Not that we want them to go out of business. So now let's move more into the right here, because these policy ideas that are resurfacing, back to what we were talking about earlier, that we can wield power. I get this a lot from my listeners on my radio show, that they feel like when I say this, I'm saying we're disarming, and I'm trying to explain to them, we're not disarming ourselves, we're disarming Washington, so the left can't hurt us any more than we can hurt the left. And I do understand there's this political idea that they've been coming after us, we need to go after them. And my view is that the way we go after them is we take away their power to come after us.
Yeah, that's what conservatives used to be for. But now we're seeing a bunch of policies emanating from the right, exactly as you said, like, why don't we use this power to affect our own ends? But again, you're not always going to be in power. And regardless of whether it's a conservative or a progressive that's changing tax policy or regulatory policy back and forth, That uncertainty begins to cause problems in the economy. The constant regulatory ping pong between, okay, my tax rate's 10% now it's 15, now it's 20, now it's back to 15. That kind of stuff is way worse than just having stable, predictable tax and regulatory policy. So that's the big risk by trying to do what the left is doing, but with slightly different branding.
So let me play devil's advocate here, because I get this when I bring up this topic. A lot of people saying, well, we are not actually on the right, ever shrinking government. And I guess my point is, look at the deregulatory record that we have, which is good. But how do you address that point of people on the right who feel like we always say we want to cut the size and scope of federal government and we never do?
Yeah, that's a fair criticism. I've been very frustrated. I mean, I started my career and I was very worried about our $12 trillion debt, and that just seems cute now. And so Republicans need to understand that, yes, when we get power, we've actually got to do these things. We got a taste of it, actually, at the beginning of the Trump administration. The 2-in, 1-out deregulatory policy, the massive tax cuts that happened, those were good things. And it shows that you can affect conservative victories, but it's a commitment issue. And I worry that we're really losing that commitment now, because it's just a lot easier to say, well, we're going to just do what the Democrats have done over all these years, but with conservative branding on it. And that ratcheting effect is going to be incredibly problematic. And we're already seeing that the consumers are left in the lurch. There's a lot of these different policies that get proposed, particularly in the tech sector right now, where you've got Republicans and Democrats mad at tech companies for different reasons, right? Republicans are upset that the tech companies are suppressing information. Democrats think that they're allowing too much information. And what you have right now is an attack on both fronts on American tech companies, and all that's doing is empowering Chinese tech companies. And so we are at a real risk here of throwing the baby out with the bathwater as we continue to have these fights over how we're going to best use government to affect our own ends, instead of allowing entrepreneurs and innovators to make those decisions.
What should we be thinking of if, for some reason, we are able to win in November, the White House, the Senate, the House? I mean, if you could talk to them, what's the first thing you think they need to have at the forefront of their mind?
They need to have in the forefront of their mind they've got 4 years at a minimum, 8 years at a maximum, and that they're not going to be in power forever. And that the precedents, right, this is a country that is unique in its success because we have a British common law system. And precedent has an enormous bearing on what happens in the future. And so when you begin to undo really good conservative precedents in the name of trying to achieve conservative ends, you're going to create huge gaps for progressives to be able to drive a truck through. And you're also going to create problems where you are creating problems for consumers that may be completely opposite of what you're trying to do. I mean, nowhere is this more prominent than when you're attacking the tech sector. And I keep talking about that because that is where the antitrust proving ground is right now, where we keep having these conversations about tech. Well, how are we going to protect our kids, but we want to blow open these tech companies? Well, those two things don't align, because if you're talking about protecting kids, we've got a bill that passed, a law now that says TikTok has to divest, okay? There's a national security issue there. There's a parental issue there. Folks have concerns with TikTok. Congress acted. But the mechanism by which it acts is to say that the app stores run by Apple and Google can no longer list TikTok if they don't divest. Yet at the very same time, we have lawsuits at the Department of Justice and legislation floating around in the states and in the federal government that would force smartphones to be more open, and therefore would make it easier for kids to go around those app stores and just download TikTok straight from the open web. And so again, it gets back to the regulation, the pile of regulation that we're seeing, and the fact that conservatives are now beginning to add to that shows that again, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and we've got these policies that are achieving completely opposite ends.
We probably ought to meditate on this point just a moment so everybody understands, because I'm in the camp that TikTok is a national security issue given what we know. So it's good that we're trying to force them to have a sale. But at the same time, the way the legislation would work, as you pointed out, is that Apple and Google would have to take TikTok out of their stores if they don't divest. But at the same time, The federal government wants to make it so that Apple and Google have to allow people to download standalone apps outside of their store so that TikTok could still be on people's phones even as they're not allowed in the stores for Apple and Google. It actually does not make any sense.
And that's exactly what's happening, because there is a large push to, and this kind of gets back to our original point, to say, well, I'm doing something about this, versus thinking about the long-term consequences of those actions. And that, I think, is the big problem that we have right now. There's this sense that, and I think it's fair to say, well, when Republicans have had power, what have we done? And that's a fair criticism, but that's not an excuse to then get power and do things that are backwards, and do things that are going to cause more harm than good. Put cybersecurity at risk, put kids at risk. I mean, big bill that's being debated in Washington right now, the Kids Online Safety Act. I think there's a lot of constitutional problems with that bill, but if you're talking about wanting to keep kids safe online, why are you talking about also, in the same breath, and a lot of the same legislators as well, talking about making a lot of the security features that are built into phones illegal because you're worried about competition concerns? We've got to prioritize one or another here. Like Thomas Sowell said, I love coming back to that quote, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I don't think we're really adequately weighing trade-offs in Washington anymore.
Not only are we not weighing trade-offs, but it also seems like we have a lot of people in Congress who have no idea how the hell any of this stuff works, trying to legislate. I'm reminded of, what was it, the late Ted Stevens, and his explanation of the internet was a series of tubes carrying information. It really does seem like Congress is out of their wheelhouse, and so they're relying on third-party groups who have vested interests in shaping legislation in ways that are good, not necessarily for consumers or the middle class, but for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting that, this recent antitrust case against Google, the administration and some of its allies on the right are saying this is a huge victory for consumers, but the biggest beneficiary of the antitrust case against $2 trillion Google is a $3 trillion Microsoft. I mean, that's not fighting for the little guys. You're talking about business decisions and business disagreements that are not being litigated in the market, they're being litigated in courtrooms, and they're being litigated in the halls of Congress.
Well, let me jump in here, because I've talked about this on radio, because I've got mixed feelings on it, because I do have concerns with Google, but it seems like, because one of the things the court found is that Google is paying Apple billions of dollars to be the default search engine, that the way this will work as a resolution is that Apple will no longer get billions of dollars from Google, but Google will still be everybody's default search engine, because Google has become the verb to search the internet. So Google actually wins and saves money through the lawsuit that determined that Google violated antitrust.
Yeah, we'll see what the remedies end up being. I mean, there are some folks that want to see vast breakups of these companies and want to bar these companies, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Apple, any of the big companies that make up a good amount of everyone's 401k, prohibit them from really effectively competing again in the future, making new mergers and acquisitions. And I think that's really concerning. That's a potential remedy to say, well, and we've seen that in legislation as well, saying, well, we're not going to let these companies grow any larger than they are now, ignoring the fact that the investments those companies make are what attracts new companies into the market in the first place. We've made it very hard for companies to go public, and so a lot of investors, and particularly in Silicon Valley, say, well, your business proposition is, I'm going to invest in you and I need to get paid back. And there's only three ways I get paid back. You get huge and successful on your own, unlikely. You go public, which is even harder because of federal regulation. The size of companies that are going public these days continues to grow, which means you don't have small businesses becoming publicly traded at a very high rate anymore. You already have mega corporations that are the ones going public. Or you get acquired by a larger corporation. And if you take away those paths to investor exit, you're not going to have investor entry. And I worry about the stultifying and the ossification of the American tech sector and the American innovation sector broadly, not unlike what we see in the European Union. What's happening right now in Washington in terms of regulation of the tech sector, regulation of competition policy broadly, is a direct copy of the playbook that the European Union has put in place. And I'd challenge anyone in this room, name a large European tech company. I can name a bunch of large Chinese tech companies, right? Tencent, TikTok, ByteDance. The largest European tech company barely registers in the Forbes, or the Fortune 100. There's one. And this is an economic bloc that has twice the population of the United States, and prior to the financial crisis had a larger GDP than the United States. And it doesn't produce cutting-edge companies. And the regulators here in the United States are saying, wow, what they're doing over there, we'd like that over here.
You mentioned that. Well, first, to end the punchline on the Google antitrust, it is somewhat funny that the winner of the Google antitrust, besides potentially Google, is Microsoft, the last company sued for antitrust, which is kind of wild. But then in the EU, it's funny, they're passing all these regulations, and every company they intend to regulate happens to be an American tech company. None of there aren't enough over there to qualify. Maybe Spotify, I guess, but and the Biden administration isn't standing up for the American tech companies in Europe.
In fact, we've found that your tax dollars have been paying for U.S. regulators to go over to the European Union, go over to Brussels, and actually cooperate and help the European Union craft these types of regulations that are targeting and extracting from American tech companies. Say what you want about the American tech companies. They've made a lot of political decisions that, I can't defend. But at the same time, that's trillions and trillions of dollars of value and millions of jobs in the U.S. economy that is being openly attacked by our allies in the European Union, and the Biden administration is using your tax dollars to help them.
So let me get into a question from the crowd that it came up, and it wasn't particularly directed at you, but we mentioned Google and these tech companies. There is a view, one I increasingly share, that a number of these companies are pretty openly hostile to conservatives. And so I understand the impulse of conservatives to say we've got to fight back and maybe we have to use the government to fight back against these companies. What is your recommended solution for those of us who do have this concern that a lot of these companies aren't just progressive companies, they're progressive companies helping to advance progressivism?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a difficult one. And these are the difficult questions that I see a lot of folks on the right these days are avoiding. It's just easier to say, well, liberals want to break them up too, so we're just going to do that, and we're going to undo all of the antitrust victories that we've had as conservatives because we got to do something about these companies. Not thinking down the road that, well, oil and gas is next, or that major retailers are next, you name it. I think it requires looking deeper at the type of incentives that are coming out of Washington right now. Forget looking at FTC and DOJ for solutions. Look at what's happening at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We actually have a project at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Foundation, SEC Mission Creep, because the SEC is increasingly becoming sort of a social regulator because you have activist investors in this country that are able, because of SEC rules, to get items on corporate shareholder ballots at a very easy rate, to the extent that Bernie Sanders was able to speak at Walmart's shareholders meeting. I mean, that shouldn't be able to happen easily, but it's happening because the SEC has lowered the threshold for activist progressive groups to be able to force companies to weigh in on these issues. And these companies don't want to do it, but if their shareholders are forcing them to, that's a big problem. And I think we ought to look at that. We ought to look at why is the SEC tipping the scales to make it easier for progressives to force companies to be getting involved in social issues where they otherwise wouldn't. You start there, and then when I look at things like antitrust, that's a break glass solution, right? We're not there yet. We haven't even tried the fire extinguisher.
So you mentioned that. I do an ad for the bank that I use. It's called Old Glory Bank. It's an online bank. Instead of trying to start a bank from scratch, they purchased a bank in Oklahoma. They did rebranding. They expanded the platform. And it was set up by a bunch of conservatives who have been concerned about banks that are seeing progressives buy the shares, become activists, pressure the banks to close the accounts of gun stores, gun manufacturers, conservative activists. And this company, as they're trying to grow and get investors, actually avoided being publicly traded and looked for investors who could invest in a different way to avoid progressives being able to come in and buy the shares. And it struck me as they went through this process that here's a model American bank by conservatives for conservatives concerned about this situation that had to go out of its way with lawyers to find a way to get investors because it knew if it decided to be publicly traded, you could have a bunch of progressives buy the shares and then, because of the SEC, force them out of their mission.
Right. So I think we could solve a lot of these problems without opening up and loading a bazooka for progressives to do whatever they want when they're in power by simply paring back and keeping these types of objective standards of regulation that we've fought hard for and expanding those. I think we need to have objective standards of regulation of shareholder issues at the SEC. We don't have that right now. Progressive groups submit these issues into the SEC. It goes into a black box, and we don't know who at SEC decides what corporations have to vote on. But I can guarantee you it's a long-time progressive bureaucrat that's worked in Washington for decades. And it's being influenced by the progressive administration. So we've got to open that up, have more transparency in those types of issues of what publicly traded companies have to be working on. Because I can tell you, a lot of them don't want to be dealing with these issues, but they feel that they have to appease a government that is increasingly weaponizing itself.
It's funny you say that. I know a couple of CEOs, and this conversation comes up with the progressive issues that they take on. And one of the things they mention is, you don't understand, we all now have chief diversity officers. And if I scale this back, I get labeled a racist and fired. That person leaves and goes into academia. And the SEC constantly comes up in shareholder fights that people don't understand this. And you mentioned earlier, and a CEO for a major corporation told me this, that the danger that we have on our side is that we are setting precedents the left is not just going to use against oil and gas companies, but gun manufacturers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really the core thing here is they don't, the hangover of I'm sure it'll feel great if you achieve the antitrust or regulatory victory for conservative ends against a major corporation that you dislike. But the hangover of that is it's going to be turned around and used against you tenfold, because the progressives are a lot better at wielding the weapons of government than we are. And again, we're not always going to be in power. It's an inconvenient truth. Again, I think it's really important to get back to that kind of core issue of where is this stuff emanating from, because the purpose of a business and a corporation, right, is to deliver value to their shareholders. So that is where you've got to begin to look at solutions. Because otherwise, again, we're at a real risk here of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and, again, ossifying the dynamic investment in tech sector and innovation sector and other corporations that we're seeing. I think that's a huge problem. And it's something that, again, it feels like the easy solution. It's an easy solution over a political horizon, right? The average elected official is only thinking over the next 2 to 6 to 8 years. But these decisions that we're making now are going to have lasting consequences for decades. And so it's about making sure to have that foresight and say, let's not go get the quick, easy win. Let's treat the lasting core issue here, and hopefully that will pay dividends for decades.
So before we wrap up, let's get back into the Taxpayer Protection Alliance specifically. If people want to get involved or find out more with what you guys do, where should they go?
Yeah, so our website is protectingtaxpayers.org. You can find us on Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it these days, at Protect Taxpayers.
The Supreme Court 9-0 ruled it's called Twitter.
I did see that.
Yes.
I did see that. So it's an important precedent. We'll
yes.
get back to that. But yeah, that's the easiest way to find us. Go online, find us at www.protectingtaxpayers.org. We talked a lot about the issues that I see in the regulatory state right now, but we work on lots of different issues. We work on IRS accountability. We work on sports stadium spending accountability. Something that I've weighed in on recently, where a lot of
good for you.
Public tax dollars going to billionaires doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I thought we were fiscal conservatives. But so we work on any sort of issue under the economic sun, trying to keep government limited and accountable, and make sure that whether it's progressives or Republicans and conservatives, that we're not creating weapons in government that can be used against the taxpayer and the consumer.
Well, and let's end on that point then, because I just, and again, this isn't to be a broken record, and I don't want to bore the crowd, but because it comes up so much, and it is my biggest fear with where we're headed, I can see it coming. You saw it when the Obama administration set a bunch of precedents, and I was writing at the time that what the Democrats don't understand is they're setting precedents that if Donald Trump got elected, he would use, and he did. And then had to say again to the Republicans, you're setting precedents the Democrats are going to use, because there is no permanence in politics. Unless we're suddenly going to abandon our constitutional system, which we're not going to do, that I do think conservatives really have to think about. I want to throw the punch but when we've thrown the punch, we can't they're going to punch back, and the only way to stop them from punching back is to essentially take away their arms. And the way you take away their arms is you take away Washington's power to throw a punch.
Yeah, absolutely. That reminds me of an old saying, right? We got to get back to this country where there's a fun saying where it's like California makes technology, Texas makes energy, Iowa makes food, Washington makes it hard. And we've got to get back to focusing on how is Washington making it hard? How do we strip those things back? How do we decentralize power? How do we give power back to the states where it's easier to achieve political victories? You're able to disperse and decentralize that power, these problems become a lot less severe. Because when Washington weighs in on something, it has obviously national ramifications, and it carries a much bigger weight. You impact interstate commerce versus let's keep the bad policies for the most part isolated to the places where people are voting for those things, and not have effectively California regulators running the country, which they're basically doing in Washington right now.
So let's end where we began. Your family's small business. You mentioned the Code of Federal Regulations. You're not the first person to say this, and we probably should end meditating on this point that the cost of federal regulation prevents an economic explosion in this country, because the governmental compliance and cost to governmental compliance is money that companies can't then reinvest in their company to grow jobs and build things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a dead weight loss, right? Every dollar that you spend on a lawyer, every dollar that you spend on an accountant is a dollar that you can't spend hiring a new machinist, hiring a new delivery driver, buying a new Ford truck to make your deliveries, what have you. I mean, that's all money that goes to Washington and pays for high-priced bureaucrats. And that's money that's not being spent. That's money spent filling out paperwork. That's not creating value, right? We got to get back to focusing on how to entrepreneurs, businesses, whether it's the largest tech companies in the country or it's the small business like my family's small business, how do we get them refocused on creating value for consumers and more interested in competing for your dollars versus competing for your votes? I think that's really important. We got to have that differentiation between competing in Washington and competing on Main Street. And right now, because of the complexity and because increasingly conservatives are abandoning free markets, which I'm very concerned about, you're going to see companies competing for political favor. And that's not healthy. That's not sustainable. That's where we end up with negative economic growth. And that's going to have huge ramifications long term. I mean, the only way we're going to get out of the fiscal crisis that we're in right now is growing our way out of it. Cut spending, sure, but we've got to grow our way out of it too. And you can't keep layering on regulations, right? We've got a problem right now of we've got a fly, and there's a lot of folks, particularly on the left, but certainly on the right, that want to swallow a spider instead of just going after the fly.
I got to confess to you, when I looked at the schedule, when somebody handed me one, it was like, oh, 45 minutes. Oh, 45 minutes. And now we've sat here for just about 45 minutes, and I actually have so much more that I could talk to you about. This is right in my wheelhouse, and it's so much of what I've been talking about with my audience on radio that we've got to not just wildly throw punches. We've got to be thoughtful and strategic in how we move, because I really am afraid about the precedents we set. So thanks for sitting here with me for as long as you have to talk about this stuff. And I hope it really does get conservatives to think that we don't want to set the precedents that they then use against us, because time and time again, we wind up being Wile E. Coyote shoving the rock off the cliff only to have it land on Wile E. Coyote.
Absolutely. And if you want to continue this conversation with me or my staff that's here, we've got a booth out there in the hallway. We'll be talking about our app security project, where we're talking about the various cybersecurity trade-offs and issues that are being created by some of the things we talked about right now. We'd love to have that conversation with you. So we'll be here all weekend. I thank you all so much for listening, and thank you for the opportunity, Erick.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that a ton.
Appreciate that. No,
absolutely.
Thanks. I'm delighted.